They say every house tells a story, and some refuse to stop speaking. Jack Klugman, the beloved actor from the Odd Couple and Quincy M.E., passed away in 2012, but the Beverly Hills home he lived in for decades has never fully let him go, or so the new owners would come to believe. It began the very first night after they moved in. The couple who bought the property described the air as unsettlingly heavy, like a stage curtain that never lifted. Though the house had been renovated and modernized, the master bedroom still bore Klugman's original wood-paneled walls. That night, as silence fell, the faint sound of a man's cough echoed down the hallway. At first, they blamed the plumbing, but it happened again at the same hour for several nights. A deep, raspy cough, the kind Jack was known for after years of smoking and battling throat cancer. By the second week, objects began shifting. The new owner recalled leaving his script notes on the kitchen counter, only to find them later stacked neatly on the piano in the living room. Neither he nor his wife had moved them. What struck them most was the precision, like someone used to rehearsing lines over and over had touched them. Neighbors weren't surprised. They remembered Klugman fondly, often speaking about how he spent his later years sitting outside, waving at passers-by. But one elderly neighbor added something chilling. Jack always said he wasn't done performing, even after death. He wanted to keep the house lively. One evening, when the couple invited friends over, the stereo suddenly clicked on by itself. A Sinatra record began to play, Jack's favorite. The friends laughed nervously, but the couple stood frozen, because they had never owned a Sinatra record, and the turntable had been left unplugged in storage. The most disturbing moment came a month later. The wife awoke around 3 a.m. to see the faint silhouette of a man in a robe at the end of the bed. His head tilted slightly as if studying her. When she blinked, he was gone, but the smell of cigar smoke lingered in the air, even though neither of them smoked. The following weeks inside Jack Klugman's former home unfolded like a slow tightening of a noose. What at first seemed like peculiar coincidences began to transform into a daily rhythm, an intrusive presence woven into the fabric of the house. The couple, Mark and Evelyn, had thought they'd found their dream home, a warm Beverly Hills property with an old Hollywood charm, set back behind hedges and a wrought iron gate. During the day, the house was beautiful, sunlight streaming across the tiled floors, the faint scent of lemon polish in the wood-paneled study, the garden alive with bougainvillea climbing up the stucco walls. But when evening settled, the house seemed to take on a second life, one that was harder to explain. The cough was no longer just a midnight occurrence. It came at unexpected times. While Mark worked late at his laptop, while Evelyn folded laundry, while the two of them sat in uneasy silence in the living room pretending not to hear it. The sound had weight, a harsh rasp followed by a low clearing of the throat, like an old man fighting for his breath. They checked the air ducts, brought in a plumber, even had the house inspected for rodents. Every professional left puzzled, assuring them nothing was wrong. Yet the cough persisted, always in the distance, always just loud enough to unsettle. Then there were the lights. The couple discovered the hallway sconces would flicker faintly when no one walked past, casting shadows that stretched unnaturally across the walls. Once, late at night, Evelyn swore she saw a silhouette form in that shifting light, broad shoulders, a familiar tilt of the head. She didn't tell Mark at first, afraid it might sound hysterical, but eventually, when she confessed, he simply nodded. He had seen it too, though he had tried to convince himself it was his imagination. The study, Jack's study, as the neighbors referred to it, became the epicenter of their unease. The room still contained an original mahogany desk, which they had planned to sell but never got around to moving. Mark, who was a screenwriter, began working there in the evenings. That's when he noticed something disturbing. Whenever he left notes or drafts scattered across the desk, he'd return to find them rearranged in neat piles. Not randomly shuffled, arranged as if someone had read them, organized them, perhaps even rehearsed them. One night, a single page of his script had been underlined in thick pencil. The words were spoken by an older, gruff character, lines written with Jack Klugman's type of voice in mind. Mark didn't own a pencil. Evelyn, meanwhile, began waking at strange hours, always between 3 and 4 in the morning. She said she could feel someone watching from the doorway, Once she thought she saw a figure in a bathrobe, blurred and faint, as though it were stitched from smoke. But what disturbed her most wasn't the sight of it. It was the smell. A sweet, stale cigar smoke filled the room, clinging to the curtains and her hair, even though the house had been professionally cleaned before they moved in. By morning, the smell was gone. The neighbors, at first amused, began to avoid conversation when the subject came up. An elderly woman across the street, who remembered Klugman well, told Evelyn quietly one afternoon. He loved that house more than anything. Even after his health failed, he refused to leave it. He said the walls gave him strength. I suppose he meant it. Her words were offered with a sad smile, but there was a weight behind them, an unspoken warning. As the weeks rolled on, the couple found themselves living not just in a home, but in a performance that never ended. Chairs scraped across hardwood at night when no one was awake. The faint sound of a typewriter clacked through the study, though no typewriter existed in the house. The piano, untouched since they moved in, rang out a single note while they ate dinner, its sound resonating long after it should have faded. Mark began to notice something even stranger. Whenever he watched old episodes of The Odd Couple or Quincy M.E. on late-night TV, the static would break across the screen just as Jack's character appeared. Sometimes the volume would drop, leaving only Jack's gravelly laugh cutting through the silence. The house had become a stage, and Jack Klugman, whether memory or spirit, was still performing. The days inside the Klugman house had begun to blur into a rhythm of unease, like the ticking of a clock that never quite lined up with the hour. What was once simply unsettling now weighed on Mark and Evelyn with the heaviness of something lived, something that demanded acknowledgement. It was Evelyn who first noticed the shift. She had taken to wandering the house in the afternoons, trying to reclaim it, trying to convince herself it was theirs and not some echo chamber for a life-long past. The sun would pour through the wide windows in the den, and for a moment the house looked normal, golden light over soft carpets, the faint hum of the city outside, her shadow stretching gently across the wall. But then, when she turned a corner, the air would change. A thickness would fall in the hallway, as though someone else had just walked past. She would catch it in the mirror too, a flicker at her shoulder, not her own reflection, not Mark's either. At night, the house grew restless. The noises no longer limited themselves to coughing or the occasional thump. There was a pacing now, slow and deliberate, across the upstairs landing. She would lie in bed, holding her breath, listening as the boards creaked, step by step, as if someone was walking in circles outside their door. When she gathered the courage to open it, the landing was empty, but the air smelled faintly of stale aftershave. Mark, in his stubbornness, tried to ground it all in reason. He spent more and more time in the study, surrounding himself with his notes and his laptop, telling himself that work would shield him from the madness. Yet even he began to unravel. One night he left the study door closed and locked, only to wake at dawn and find the door ajar. Inside, his script pages were not only rearranged but stacked into two neat piles, as if divided into good and bad. In the good pile, a scene had been circled in pencil, his dialogue underlined with such precision that it felt almost like direction from someone long experienced in the art of performance. Mark stared at it for nearly an hour, the handwriting unfamiliar yet oddly confident, as though left by someone who still believed the house was theirs. The tension began to seep into their relationship. Evelyn accused Mark of downplaying what they were living through, of trying to treat it as material for his writing instead of facing the reality of it. "You don't hear it the way I do," she whispered one night after another hour of pacing outside the bedroom. "You don't see him watching." Mark wanted to argue, but he didn't, because deep down he had seen something too. It was in the living room late one evening. He had stayed up, half asleep on the couch, when he opened his eyes to the sound of shuffling. In the corner, by the piano, a figure sat slouched, as if resting between performances. The outline was hazy, almost transparent, but the posture, the robe, the broad hands folded loosely, was unmistakable. The air was heavy with smoke, though no cigar glowed. The figure looked toward him, and for a fleeting moment, Mark felt as though he were the intruder. Then, just as quickly, the figure was gone, leaving only silence and the faint scent of burnt tobacco. The house began to resist them in other ways. Doors that had always swung easily now groaned open as if reluctant. The lights dimmed in unison, as though controlled by a hand unseen. And when they tried to bring guests, the house seemed to rebel. A friend of Evelyn's, invited for dinner, left halfway through the evening after insisting she felt watched from the hallway. She had refused to come back. Another guest laughed it off until a framed photograph fell from the mantel onto the floor at his feet, glass shattering across the rug. What unsettled Evelyn most was the sound of the typewriter. It began faintly, like the tapping of a distant branch on glass, then grew into a steady rhythm, keys striking paper with deliberate force. She would hear it from the kitchen, from the stairs, echoing faintly through the study. When she finally entered, the desk would be perfectly still, the air holding that same thick silence that seemed to follow her everywhere. But one night, she caught something different. On the desk lay a single sheet of paper, crisp and white, words hammered into it by a typewriter that did not exist in the house. The sentence was simple, chilling in its clarity. "This is still my stage." The message on the paper haunted Evelyn long after she crumpled it and shoved it into the bottom drawer of the desk. She told herself she had imagined it, that her exhaustion and paranoia had conjured the words. But in the days that followed, she couldn't shake the feeling that they had been left there for her specifically. A statement, a warning. Mark, however, reacted differently. Instead of fear, he became strangely energized by the idea. He joked, at least at first, that Jack Klugman himself had become his editor. He spoke about the spirit as though it were simply another eccentric Hollywood neighbor, one who hadn't quite learned to let go. "If he wants this to be his stage," Mark said one evening, "maybe we should just let him have it. Maybe that's the only way he'll quiet down." But Evelyn didn't laugh. She had begun to dread every corner of the house. The shadows seemed deeper now, holding shapes she could almost recognize but dared not stare at too long. When she climbed the stairs, she felt as if someone were directly behind her, each step matched by one just out of sync. At night, she would lie awake and hear the drawers of the old desk sliding open and closed on their own. Then came the voices. At first, faint murmurs like the low hum of a television left on in another room. But slowly, over nights of broken sleep, the words grew clearer. She would hear them drifting down the hallway or seeping from the vents. Fragments of dialogue, rehearsed lines, the repetition of a phrase until it grew ragged with frustration. She knew she wasn't imagining it because Mark began to hear it too. One night, as they sat together in the dim light of the living room, they both heard the same words at once. A gravelly voice, close and unmistakable, muttered from the corner of the room. "Again. Say it again." Mark froze. Evelyn felt her blood turn cold. Neither of them moved for several minutes, the silence that followed heavier than any sound. When Mark finally stood to check the corner, there was nothing there, just the faint lingering smell of smoke and the sense that they had been eavesdropping on something rehearsed for them alone. The house began to dictate their routines. They avoided the study yet found themselves drawn to it all the same. Mark, against Evelyn's pleas, returned often, as though compelled by a pull he couldn't name. He claimed his writing had taken on new life, that inspiration came easily now, but Evelyn noticed the change in him. He spoke in shorter bursts, sometimes muttering phrases under his breath as if repeating lines fed to him from elsewhere. And the house itself seemed to resist her presence. Evelyn would walk into a room and feel the temperature drop so suddenly it prickled her skin. Doors would close softly just as she entered, the latch catching as though the house were denying her entry. Once, in the upstairs bathroom, the mirror fogged as though filled with steam, but she hadn't run the water. When she wiped it clear, she swore she saw the outline of a man standing behind her. The piano was the final straw. It hadn't been played in years, yet one night, around 3 in the morning, the unmistakable sound of a melody drifted through the house. It was slow, almost tender, a few halting notes that carried through the stillness like a memory refusing to fade. Evelyn shook Mark awake, and they both crept down to the living room. The lid of the piano was open. The keys moved, each one pressed with the weight of invisible fingers. They stood frozen as the melody continued, uneven yet deliberate, as if someone long out of practice was still determined to play. When the music stopped, the room fell into silence. Then, in the reflection of the polished black surface of the piano, Evelyn saw him. Not clear, not solid, but enough the tilt of his head, the robe draped around him, the faint shape of a man watching them through the reflection. She screamed, and the reflection vanished, leaving only their own pale faces staring back. From that night onward, she refused to be alone in the house. But Mark was drifting somewhere Evelyn could not follow. He spoke less to her and more to the empty rooms, as though someone were listening. She caught him once, late at night, sitting in the study with the desk lamp on, reading aloud from his script while pausing for long silences, as though waiting for feedback. And in those silences, Evelyn swore she heard another voice answering. The house had stopped feeling like theirs long before they admitted it out loud. By the time the final weeks arrived, Mark and Evelyn were no longer living in a home, they were surviving inside a performance. One written and directed by a man who had been dead for years, yet still refused to leave the stage. Mark changed first. What had begun as nervous jokes about Jack Klugman editing his work had twisted into a quiet obsession. He spent whole nights in the study, his face lit by the lamp's yellow glow, reading and rereading dialogue into the empty room. Sometimes Evelyn would stand outside the door and listen. He wasn't rehearsing his own words anymore. He was reciting scenes from Quincy M.E. word for word, his voice low and rasping, imitating the cadence of the actor who once walked those same halls. Between each scene, there would be a pause and then, faint but clear, a second voice, broken and gravelly, would whisper something back. She never heard the exact words, but she knew what it was. A director's correction. A cue. The further he slipped, the more the house itself seemed to reject her. The lights flickered when she entered rooms, shadows clung to her in mirrors, and the nightly pacing outside their bedroom grew so loud it shook the floorboards. She begged Mark to leave, but he wouldn't. He claimed the house was finally giving him the recognition he deserved, that Klugman had chosen him as his successor. "He doesn't want us gone," Mark told her one night, his eyes glassy, his face pale from lack of sleep. "He just wants me to keep it alive." The breaking point came with the piano. That night, the melody didn't stop. It played steadily, a halting tune that dragged Evelyn out of a restless sleep. She stumbled downstairs to find Mark sitting at the bench, his fingers moving in jerks across the keys, playing as though guided by someone else's hands. The lid rattled, the air vibrated, and behind him, reflected in the glossy black surface, she saw the faint image of Klugman himself, hunched and smiling, his robe draped over ghostly shoulders. Evelyn screamed, but Mark didn't even look up. His eyes were fixed on the keys, his mouth moving silently, as though reciting lines only he could hear. When she tried to pull him away, he shoved her back with a force that didn't feel like his own. "Don't interrupt," he hissed, his voice strange, gravelly, almost identical to the cough-ridden tone they had both heard for weeks. She fled that night. She grabbed her car keys and drove until the house was nothing but a dark silhouette in the rearview mirror. When she returned the next morning with her brother, Mark was gone. The study was in disarray, pages of script scattered across the floor, the old mahogany desk overturned. On the piano sat a single sheet of paper, typed neatly in bold letters. The show must go on. Mark was never found. The police combed the property, but there was no sign of forced entry, no sign of struggle, only the lingering smell of cigar smoke and the faint sound of footsteps pacing the upstairs landing long after the house had been emptied. Evelyn sold the home within months, unable to set foot inside again. The new buyers, unaware of the history, laughed when neighbors told them who had once lived there. But the laughter never lasted long, because by the first night, they too heard it. A cough in the hallway, deep and rasping, followed by a voice rehearsing lines in the dark. Jack Klugman was gone, but his house, his stage, would never let anyone else take the spotlight. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.